Hey everyone, it is so good to be with you this morning. I want to thank the band for doing that song. That was a great job on that song, and Krista always knocking it out of the park. Such a great song and such a good job on it. Tim recommended that song to me a couple of weeks ago. My son Tim, he said, "Dad, this is a great song. I think it will tie in with 11:11. It really resonates with who that community is." And he was right. I agree with him. It really does. It's got this rawness to it that sort of confronts us and opens up this question. And I think we're comfortable with these kinds of questions, and comfortable kind of confronting ourselves in relation to them. In particular, this song to me was such a simple lyrical structure, but it really invites us to think about the way our biases shape things around us, how we see one another, how we see God. I mean, we give God a shape and form. Oftentimes we project that onto God, right? From our own understanding, whether it's our upbringing, our cultural, our religious, our family, we project that reality onto God. What God is, what God isn't. And then we project that kind of reality on people we see as well. So not surprisingly, the people we're uncomfortable with, God is uncomfortable with too. The people that we hate, God kind of hates too. The people that we find wrong, God finds wrong, are excluded from God, from relationship with God. So we have this way of sort of creating these things, and we're just giving God the blues, is what the song says. I mean, no matter how and all the different ways we look at one another, we end up giving God the blues all the time. Even if we see ourselves in relation to God as the very ground of our being, the way that Paul Tillich, the theologian, talks about it. If God is the very substance of who we are, how many different ways do we mess with that and with one another? We just give God the blues. So it really fits today with what we're talking about, because we're talking about don't be a jerk, an introduction to the kingdom of heaven, and in particular, how do our narratives shape us? Because it's All Saints Day, right? The day after Halloween, All Hallows Eve, it's All Saints Day. We think about our family, past family members, their extended family and friends who are gone to us now, and we think about their impact on us, for good or for ill, the stories that we grew up with, the way in which their lives have narratively influenced how we see ourselves. So it's really pertinent, I think, that all this fits together for us to be thinking about what Jesus is doing with the Sermon on the Mount. So here's a couple of things I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes. I'm going to read from the text. That's the first thing. The second thing, I'm going to ask you a question that I think sets it all up. The third thing is I'm going to tell you a baseball story that a friend of mine tells, and it just fits well because it speaks to how we create out of the moment the landscape of possibilities for reframing our stories and how that relates to what Jesus is doing. And it's also the end of the baseball season. The World Series was this past week, and so I'm going to tell you a baseball story. The fourth thing is I want to talk about the word lust, because I just love the word lust, and we're going to play with that a little. And then the fifth thing, I'm going to invite a special guest to read a poem and share that with us. And it really hits the nail on the head, but also she's somebody we hadn't seen in a long time. She's going to be back with me in a couple of weeks for an interview, and then I'll wrap it all up. So those 6 things. So let me start with a reading from the scriptures here, from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. Just going to read along, kind of skip around. The Beatitudes he's already said the Beatitudes, and now he's doing what's called the extensions to the law of Moses, the Torah. He's doing these extensions. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, then how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything but to be trampled under your foot. You are the light of the world, and a town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand so that it illuminates the whole house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your goodness and reflect on God's glory in heaven. Do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets, but instead I have come to fulfill them. So he gives an example. He says, you have heard it said to people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. And anyone who calls another a fool, or maybe if they were to call him a jerk, will be in danger of the fires of hell. And then further on he says, you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks on a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And then further down, he says, an eye for an eye. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist the evil person. And if anyone slaps you on the face, turn your other cheek and offer it to them as well. If someone offers to or wants to sue you and asks for your shirt, then give them your coat as well. And then finally he says, you have heard it said, love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, for that way you will be seen as children of God in heaven, who causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So here's my question. What is the story you want to experience in life? How do you want your story to be seen? In other words, what is the story you want to be living out of? And not just simply, kind of what do you want to be when you grow up, but I mean, how do you see your story evolving, continuing to evolve in the context of the larger story? That's really what Jesus is doing with the Sermon on the Mount. He's inviting his listeners to see themselves in a new way within the context of God's kingdom. Because he said, the kingdom is at hand. It's here now. How do you live in relation to that? So what would you want your story? How would you want to experience your story? And in the bigger picture, he gives an example for us. He says, you are the salt of the earth. And our tendency is to see that as a character. We tend to label people as salt of the earth. We tend to say, well, that person's just good people. He's salt of the earth. Good core values, hardworking, and good man, good father, good mother, raise their children. I mean, those are just good people. But what we're really saying is we like their values. They have values like we have. And so we call them salt of the earth. But what we're saying is they're people we like. God must like them too. It's really not what Jesus is saying, I don't think. Because he says, a salt that's lost its flavor. In other words, being salt is bringing flavor to the moment. Think of a person that you've been around that just being in their presence has enhanced your own story. That being with them has enhanced your own understanding of yourself, has affirmed you in ways you hadn't thought about, has empowered you in ways that you didn't see coming, right? Those are people who they add flavor to the encounters, to the relationships, to their moments that they're in. And it fits well with what Jesus is saying about the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and that God is there in the moment with the broken, because that's the part that we're invited to. We're invited to participate in those broken moments, to expand, to enliven, to reconcile and restore that narrative. The same is true with light of the world, right? It illuminates the path around us. It illuminates the possibilities of our lives. So you think of a person who when we talked about teaching and learning, that we were talking about teaching is really opening up something we didn't see, opening up a possibility we didn't know. It can be a problem, it can be a challenge that does that, right? It can be something that breaks open our reality in a way that we hadn't really seen it or expected it. And now we have this chance to learn from that, perhaps. So being the salt and being light are ways of being in the world narratively. I want to suggest that for me, when I think about what it's like to think about what I want my story to be, oftentimes it's rooted more in my anxiety. The narratives are sort of like who I ought to be. The stories I've kind of grown up that said, this is what success is, and this is what you should be. And so I grew up with those kind of stories that for me have been the motivations behind what I want to be. I want my story to be. When in fact, the reality is I'm invited to be a part of something larger, and I have a place in that. I have a way of bringing myself to those moments that actually can bring salt and light to those experiences. A problem for us, I think, is that we grow up with these narratives in such a way that they become ingrained, and we don't really see them. We really don't take a moment to reflect on them until something does break them open, until something does challenge the story. That's what we found out when I was interviewing those 5 people for a number of weeks back, that series, when I would interview Sonia and some others. What we found was the stories we had grown up with, the religious stories, the religious narrative we'd grown up with, or that we were living in, was challenged by something. And it forced us to either retreat, or the invitation was to move forward into the unknown with where this story might go. But what Jesus is saying is because that's where God is, in the possibilities of what can happen, what can be enlarged and expansive and healing. And so, for example, a divorce might cause one to question how they've understood their reality. A sexual impropriety by a pastor causes the church to suddenly question its own existence, for example. A pandemic causes a world, and especially like the United States, a place of privilege, to question its understanding of where it is in the world and where God is and who we are and who we might be. And a lot of us want to retreat, right? We want to go back. But the invitation is in that brokenness to see what's possible, what more is now possible, now that we're seeing things a little more clearly. Now that Black Lives Matter, for example, has challenged us with our own narratives that have been half narratives, incomplete narratives, narratives of privilege that didn't see the other side, for example. And another young black man killed unnecessarily this past week in Philadelphia, and we're just beginning to see the injustices have caused us to question our own participation in ways we didn't see happening, in ways we didn't see before. So the challenge is then the invitation is to see what is the kingdom of heaven, what is the kingdom of God that's breaking into these moments, inviting us to be a part of and to do. A friend of mine tells this story of the unexpected. And it's a baseball story. Kevin Kling, storyteller up in Minnesota, tells this wonderful story. It's his brother's bachelor party. And so the groomsmen all decide they don't know what to do with them and what would be fun. And so instead of doing the usual sort of night party kind of thing, they decide to go to a Minnesota Twins game. Because as Kevin Kling says, where else would you experience unparalleled fun and unbridled adrenaline? Especially at a Minnesota Twins game where basically the Twins, back in those days, didn't have much of a reputation, didn't have much of a competitive edge or story to be told, so to speak. But what Kevin would say is Kevin said that baseball, he's learned, is really this place where it's really a spiritual exercise in waiting for the unexpected. That's what he'd come to see baseball as. A painter's palette that allowed so many elements and possibilities with what the landscape offered, that you could create a wider landscape given what you have there. But it required that anticipation, that anticipation and participation in co-creating. So he tells the story that it's the seventh inning, bottom of the seventh for the Twins. The score was tied at 0. And Kling said the combination of the afternoon heat and a few beers and the inaction that was on the field, and pretty soon one of the guys in the group said, hey. He pointed out a kid that was sitting about 12 rows down in the next section eating cheese nachos. He said, you see that kid? $5 says that when he's finished with those nachos, he will lick out the leftover cheese from that tin. I'll jump in on that, they said. And they started getting money together. And as they were starting to put their money in on the bet, one of them, known affectionately as Brainer, said, wait a minute, wait. Now let's be clear. Are you suggesting that he specifically must remove the dairy product from the tray with his tongue, or can he scoop it out with his finger before? And they said, his tongue. He will lick it out of the tray. Now, shut up or put up. Put up or shut up. So he said that they pulled out their wallets and they tossed their money into the ball cap. And when the fans around them had started to notice the commotion that was going on over in that one section, the fans nearby in the other rows were saying they wanted in on the action too. And pretty soon Kevin Kling said that within minutes you could see the subtle commotion that was taking place throughout that section of the stands as bills passed this way and that way, each one attached with a little piece of paper from that person with their name and with the words on it, tongue or finger. Suddenly the action stopped as a cheer rose from the other sections. And one of the guys said, look, was it a premature look? Premature lick. They looked down at the kid. He was still eating the nachos. And then one of the others said, no. It was just a foul ball tipped out into the stands. They let out a sigh of relief so that they could focus their attention back on the action. And by now, the nachos were completely finished, except for the remaining cheese. An eerie hush came over that section in the stadium as they all started to lean in and watch the kid. Slowly, like a pitcher on the mound, the kid checked left and then right. Come on, kid, they were saying. Lick it, said one of the guys. Shh, you'll spook him, said another. The kid lifted his forefinger, seemingly indecisive, when suddenly in a surprise move, he grabbed the tray with both hands, brought it to his face, and with his tongue, he licked out the cheese. A huge cheer went up from that section where the groomsmen were so loud that it even caught the attention of the future Hall of Famer twins center fielder Kirby Puckett, who looked toward the bachelor party, stepped back, and doffed his cap. Kevin Kling concluded his story saying, "I love baseball." The thing that I want to suggest with this and the Sermon on the Mount is just this. That's a fun way of thinking of this, but basically it's this. Jesus invited them to hear the narrative differently. Given the landscape of their own experience there, Jesus invited them to see what was possible. But the first thing they had to understand was that that's where God was in that brokenness and the possibility of reconciliation. The extensions, what Amy Jo Levine says with the extensions that Jesus teaches then with, you've heard it said not murder, but I say if you hate, you've already committed murder. What she says Jesus is doing there is that he is offering a wider landscape of seeing how to live in relationship to one another in a preventive way. Don't start hating because that might lead to violence. I want to suggest that what Jesus is doing is really saying, or at least what the community was understanding, was that we are invited to begin to see one another in that sacred relationship as I, thou, the way Martin Buber, the theologian, would say, that we stop seeing one another as object, but we start seeing one another as imago Dei, as the very image of God in our presence. And that when we begin to do that, it changes the narrative. When we begin to see one another as images of God, as sacredness in form, incarnate, in all of our moments, then it begins to reframe the narrative. So that in fact, hating really isn't possible and is just as destructive if we go there, if we see one another as object. That lust really is not destructive until we begin to see one another as object. And this is where I wanted to play with the word lust. Because if you look at the word lust, it took on a sexual evil connotation, and the church has done a great job of helping us with understanding sexuality. We can go there another day. But the idea of lust really had in its earliest roots and etymology, it really meant playfulness and kind of adventuresome. And in the sense of when you would say Jane, you knew how fun she was because she just had a lust for life. Or you could see how much Kevin Kling could be inventive with whatever was given to him because he just had a lust for creativity. These extensions were less about trying to widen the fence around the legalisms and were more about how we see one another. If the kingdom of heaven is at hand, then what we see one another is, that reframes how we see one another. We begin to see one another from the perspective of everyone is sacred. Everyone is the imago Dei. And the challenge, of course, is to learn how to love one another from that perspective. Thich Nhat Hanh says that love is understanding one another's suffering. And suffering not in the sense of painful suffering, but suffering in the sense of attachments, disconnections, alienation, isolation. I mean, all of these emotional kinds of suffering that we subject ourselves to, as well as actual painful physical suffering. He says love is understanding another's suffering. But he said the challenge there is we have to understand our own suffering, right, before we can begin to understand another's. As Carl Jung would say, oftentimes what we hate in another person, or what drives us crazy in another person, or what we find disdainful in another person, is often a reflection of something we're not seeing in ourselves. What are the motivations behind the narratives that we tell and the way we frame our reality? What Jesus is saying in the kingdom of heaven and in these teachings, I think, is this invitation to see that in these broken moments is where the possibilities exist, is where God exists. And the invitation then is to move from there and create a narrative that is healing, that is empowering, that is salt-like. So I want to share this poem, and I'm asking Kagan Parker, who's going to come and share this poem. Kagan is Daryl Parker's daughter. And Daryl, of course, who co-leads and hosts the Crafting Difficult Conversations. Oftentimes, Kagan will join us on that. Kagan lives up in Maryland, and she used to sing with the band, so some of you will remember her. And she's such an interesting person. I'm looking forward to my interview with her later on. But I invited her to share this story by Lim Issei, a performance poet, called Some Things That I Like. And it hits the nail on the head. I won't say any more about it, but I'll just let her read it to you now.
Some Things That I Like by Lim Issei. I like wrecks. I like ex-junkies. I like flunks and ex-flunkies. I like the way the careerless career. I like flat beer. I like people who tell half stories and forget the rest. I like people who make doodles and important written tests. I like being late. I like fate. I like the way teeth grate. I like laceless shoes, cordless blues. I like the one-bar blues. I like buttonless coats and leaky boats. I like rubbish tips and bitten lips. I like yesterday's toast. I like cold tea. I like reality. I like ashtrays. I write and like crap plays. I like curtains that don't quite shut. I like bread knives that don't quite cut. I like rips in blue jeans. I like people who can't say what they mean. I like spiders with no legs, pencils with no lead, ants with no heads, worms that are half dead. I like holes. I like coffee cold. I like creases in neat folds. I like signs that just don't know where they're going. I like angry poems. I like the way you can't pin down the sea. See?
So, what do you do with broken things? Things that seem useless to us, stuff that doesn't match up with our comfort, whether it's someone with whom we radically disagree about something, or someone who's hurt our feelings, or a relationship that seems flat and lifeless, or a homeless person, or a person of a different faith. And on and on and on. What do we do with the places and things that don't fit for us? With the family stories that seem unfinished or have been destructive, or with that guy who was arguing with us over his political view. Jürgen Moltmann says, the theologian, he says, the anticipation of joy is what hope is. Writing out our hopes and imagining wider landscapes and seeing the possibilities, all of it as grist for the mill, as writers would often say. To do so anticipates the possibility of joy. So what do these broken things represent? Oftentimes it represents something other than. It represents uselessness. It represents fear or hopelessness or even anger. But maybe, I think what Jesus is suggesting with his listeners and where the kingdom of heaven breaks into our lives, maybe they can represent the unexpected delight or the possibilities for joy or something else waiting to be created in an otherwise dull game. A bigger story than we'd ever imagined. God says, I like that place. That's where you'll find me.